Very sorry. Here we go. Can you hear me?
Beautiful. Yep.
All right.
That works.
Very good. All right. I want to encourage you to ask a question as we go along. Let's make this as interactive as possible. I don't feel offended at all if you intervene and say this is bullshit, or you have any specific questions. It would be great to make that as interactive as possible. This is actually, we run a lot of benchmarking studies. We just, I think 2 days ago or something, released a complete benchmarking study on Kubernetes that I think is super interesting. Adoption and how people use it, what people expected of Kubernetes before they started is particularly interesting. And so what we did here is that we looked at DevOps benchmarking. And I've been in the space for a while. I've always been wondering, hey, how do I compare with my setup to everything that's going on? And so we've just went ahead and said, okay, let's survey 1,850 teams, actually 53 or something. And so, yeah, you've looked at this, and we had that introduction. But let's look at the content. What we want to look at, if we talk about developer self-service, and if we talk about the benchmarking study, is not only the benchmarking study, but and I'm now already hinting at what I believe is the conclusion, and I believe that the conclusion and what we can see and learn from this data is self-service. So I don't want to walk you through boring numbers. You can look at that study yourself, but I actually rather want to really talk about how I believe you can get to the next level in terms of your DevOps journey, because looking at what doesn't work is one thing, but I think it makes more sense to look at concrete ways to actually advancing yourself and your team. And then, and that's why I want to shed more light on self-service, developer self-service. That's the topic I'm very passionate about, then when to invest into this journey and what. And then I want to build a little car with you, obviously, because I'm from Germany and we're still trying to defend that industry, although in recent years we've become somewhat under pressure. Okay, so we surveyed actually 1,856 teams, and as we surveyed them, we asked tons of questions, and we computed a DevOps maturity score from that. Most of those things are fairly straightforward. You get a higher score if you have configuration as code and you don't apply direct changes to kubectl if you want to stay in the Kubernetes world. And so you can see this beautiful curve here, and I call it the DevOps mountain of tiers. So if you look at the 50% interval, then you can actually see that many people get to a certain point, but then they actually get stuck. And very few teams are actually in that high performing bucket. We clustered those top performers with a score of 90 plus, high performers with a score between 17 and 89, mid performers with a score between 40 and 69, and then we have low performers between 0 and 39. So we asked them three things. We asked them about the architecture. So what architectural components are you actually utilizing? How are you using those? We talked about the general DevOps metrics, and then we talked about culture and all of that. And again, I don't want to walk you through these endless numbers. Most of those are somewhat as you would expect, and those that are outliers, I will definitely talk about. The architecture, in my opinion, it doesn't tell you that much, but we found the obvious things. If you are a high-performing team, you are more likely to use containerized setups, and you're more likely to use Kubernetes, and you're more likely to be in the public cloud, and you're more likely to use microservices, as you would have expected. But if we ask ourselves the question, well, how, can I change this and then I'm better, right? And we want to pinpoint what are the things that we can actually change in order to advance. Well, then it's probably naive to say, hey, I'm working in a financial service company. We have these huge monoliths. Now let's break them all down into microservices, and we will be more mature in our DevOps approach. That is nonsense, right? That's not how it works. And so I'm not a big believer of taking these things as a proxy for how we can actually get better. Now, the same thing with metrics, right? So all of the things hold true. There is a dramatically higher change failure rate in the low performers, and there is this like almost disastrous deployment frequency. But then again, if let's say you're the engineering manager, you go to your team and say, hey, could you please deploy faster? That's a little bit of a joke. You can't, this doesn't make sense at all. And I actually seen that at play. I've seen engineering managers do that. All that happens is that your change failure rate goes up. That doesn't really scale. And so again, by just looking at metrics, you can analyze the status quo, but it cannot really tell us how to get better. So why is this guy from Germany telling you all of the things that you shouldn't look at? Because there are actually things that it really makes sense to look at. And that is the team setup and culture. And when I first looked at this, I always thought, this looks like a motivational speech on LinkedIn, and someone is trying to sell me personal branding, and I have to look at team setup and culture, not again. But if you actually zoom in, that is exactly what you should look at. And that is exactly what the data is telling us. And I want to show you one of those really interesting data points. So for instance, which answer describes best how DevOps tasks are managed in your organization? Now, in 21.2% of cases, if we look at the total data set, we have a dedicated ops engineering team that takes care of DevOps tasks, and developers are strictly separated and don't care much about configurations and infrastructure. Those are the old worlds, right? We have an operations team. They're sitting somewhere in the basement, and we throw things over the fence, and they somehow have to take care. Then we have 44.6% of cases, you build it, you run it, is what we are breathing. All developers can do all DevOps tasks on their own. And then we have 34.2% of cases that say some developers can do some DevOps tasks on their own and are constantly busy helping less experienced developers. Now, two of them are pretty obvious. Like you have the guard that is still in the operations sysadmin world. We have the 54.6% that say you build it, you run it, although questionable how accurate that actually is. And then we have this in-between item, 34.2%. And I call them shadow operations. Now, shadow operations very often appears if you have somebody saying, hey, we're now doing DevOps, which means, in fact, somebody proclaims that and basically pushes responsibility into the engineering team and says, hey guys, I have this cool new tool. It's called Terraform. You're doing everything yourself now. And what happens then is that the team is overwhelmed and says, who is the person who's most interested in that? The senior engineer in Toronto, and she is now going to take care of that. And that means this senior engineer basically becomes what I call shadow operations. They are significantly reducing their total output in actual code, and they are now actually dealing with all of the deployment capabilities of the team. That is what I call shadow operations. Now, if we actually look at the low performers, you can see a clear trend here. 3.1% now say you build it, you run it is what we are breathing. We have in 52.9% of cases a dedicated operations engineer who's taking care of stuff. And in 44% of cases, we have what I call shadow ops. So good, so far so good. The actual really interesting thing comes in if we look at the high performers. And in the high performers, we have one beautiful light blue dot. And that means 10 out of 10 teams in this bucket are completely on the you build it, you run it wagon. So there is a good reason to believe that this is one of those things that we should really zoom in, because in whatever way we look at the data, and in whatever way I look at organizations, and I analyzed myself, just looked at the numbers, 249 organizational setups analyzed in calls with these organizations in the last 12 months. So I'm seeing that play out a lot in reality. I believe that this is one of those things where we should listen very carefully and look at very carefully, because there seems to be a consistent pattern here. And so let's zoom in a little bit. Let's shine a little more light on this. What does that actually mean? You build it, you run it. And in my interpretation, it means if developers can deal with the cognitive load of the respective setup, then they are actually able to do you build it, you run it. Let's remember where this comes from. I think Werner Vogel said that on one of the first AWS events in 2008 or 6, where he said, like, now developers are able to build and run everything by themselves. Now, cloud native, the new glorious world that Werner Vogel's proclaimed, is still extremely complex. And I think one of the huge mistakes is that we are not actually looking at cognitive load of the individual enough. Cognitive load means not the ability. And I think that's very important. Several, like, I think one of the consistent problems that we have as an industry is that we very often give developers the feeling, if you cannot deal with Terraform, you're dumb. And because of that, this feeling that is somewhere in the room, they actually take on more responsibility than they can actually deal with from a purely time or brain power allocation perspective. So I am actually thinking about this using this model in my head. If you have cognitive load on the one hand and complexity on the other, then you can actually sort of build as like draw this line here, and we will probably all agree, I don't know, rolling back configurations is a little less complex and needs a little less cognitive load than cluster networking at Apple's GCP account. That's really nasty. And so what I'm observing, there is a preference to each individual team for respective cognitive load, a cognitive load preference. Now, what I'm observing as well is that those teams do well that first of all acknowledge this, and that either decide, well, the cutoff point is something we operate on the left-hand side by the developer, and on the right-hand side, we actually, if you want, abstract that away. Although abstract is a very dangerous word, you actually never want to abstract developers. You want to simplify, standardize by design, and then actually be able to give them the full context in terms of observability, but they don't actually have to operate that. The much better approach is to say you're giving them golden paths that they can walk on with certain guarantees. If they follow the design principles, which reduces cognitive load, then they can actually operate that in self-service, not having to allocate too much attention to that. All right. Now, that's why my analysis is great teams understand how much complexity developers want to deal with. I think it's important that we don't talk about this in a patronizing way. It's not the ability of an individual. The people we usually work with are very smart. And if they would allocate a sufficient amount of time, everybody in the world, everybody with this technical context can understand or can learn to deal with Helm charts and complex networking, but it's really about how much can they actually allocate. And then we build what I refer to as transparent abstractions accordingly. I think it's also important to acknowledge that great teams build DevOps setups for the weakest link in the chain and not the Linux kernel hacker. And that's a little bit mean, maybe. But that's another thing that I'm very often observing. You have a room full of people, they're making a technical decision on how to set up a certain tool chain. And then they ask, yeah, how shall we do that? And then there's always the person that says, yeah, it's not a problem to use this and to use that, and to actually like change things on the go. And we can deal with all of that. And because this person is very opinionated and very self-confident, they actually influence the design of the overall setup. Now, I believe you have to find mitigation strategies to this very situation by designing the way you ask inside of your organization and how you actually get the feedback. You have to be mindful of how you ask whom in what group at what point in time. So how do you strike the balance? How do you actually understand, how do you get this cognitive load preference out of the individuals in your team? And I think the most important element here, and again, it sounds a little bit like LinkedIn motivational speech, but you have to over communicate. I'm a big fan of the way Disney is doing it internally. They have a very balanced way of gathering feedback. They are really designing the way they get feedback by talking to front end, by talking to back end, by talking to juniors in a balanced way, to develop hackathons or to do hackathons regularly in their different huge teams, so in different branches. And I'm not sure whether it's done all over Disney, but the team that I observed, I found that really remarkable. And this way they actually understand what do they actually want to do, what do we have to maybe optimize in a different way. Then I'm a big believer of golden paths over golden cages. Do never abstract people away. I think those were the big mistakes of the setups in the early 2010s, where you had platform teams, platform setups that were very restrictive, that gave poor observability, that didn't let you go down to the infrastructure as code level, plus there was almost no infrastructure as code around, and that abstracted people entirely. And so I'm always opting to say, give them golden path. If this path doesn't work, give them clear and easy ways to deviate from that path, but equip the golden path with certain guarantees. If you stay on this, you're not on pager duty, and give you certain security guarantees as an example. Then educate and empower. Pretty straightforward, although in reality it doesn't happen that much. You can actually change the cognitive load curve by investing into education. If your developers have a month to learn Helm, whatever, then they can arguably deal with a higher cognitive load, right? But you cannot just throw this at them and say, we are expecting the same output of code. Oh, and by the way, you're now also operating all of that yourself. And then there is one shift, if you want, paradigm shift that is very apparent. That is the shift from operations to platform team. And I want to focus down on this a little bit more, because I believe that this is, as a design pattern for organizations, very beneficial to this overall situation. So one of the people I worked a lot with, and who I personally, a very subjective personal opinion, see as one of the pioneers in this space is Jason Warner. And Jason was an SVP engineering at Heroku, and then went on to become the CTO at GitHub. And he built a Heroku-like experience, like a platform, but that was very transparent at GitHub. They started in May 2017. And the idea was to say that GitHub always that Jason always articulated is, if you run a setup where DevOps and Ops talks to each other, you don't have a great setup. I've received a little bit of backlash for this sentence, although it's not my sentence, but I heard criticism. But he's not actually saying they shouldn't talk about like with each other at all. Right? It's not contradicting the cultural idea of DevOps. He's saying they should not have transactional conversations. You shouldn't need to go to an operations team to get another database or to debug configurations. You should talk with them about qualitative optimizations of the setup and to reset your cognitive load preference. And so the key idea of these platform approaches is to say, well, you're basically providing the glue. All these internal platforms are golden paths and defaults and glues that help you mold the developer interaction into a consistent pattern. Now, it's glue and it's standardization. Several of the larger enterprises that I work with have 120 different Terraform repositories to get you an RDS instance. And so what we also did, and that's research that's not published yet, is we looked at the standard deviation in configuration files that want to express the same thing. So we have a configuration file for a Node.js application that is wired up to a Cloud SQL instance. So take that, not super easy to get the data, which is why it's very preliminary. But what's the actual standard deviation? We would believe it's a lot. Everybody believes that the setup, we're a very special snowflake. You can actually see that it's not a lot. It's fairly slow, and you can actually, maybe at the expense of efficiency on the cost side, that might be the case, but you can actually standardize quite a bit, and standardization is something that definitely reduces cognitive load. That is possible because we now have a significantly wider range of pre-vetted setups. I just want to look at Terraform, although there's a lot of shit in the registry, and several other things that are currently coming up. Now, before we actually come to questions and discussions, I want to transfer this model that we discussed into building cars, because I'm German and I can't do without them. So immature organizations tell teams to build a car, give them a credit card, and tell them where to find a store with raw materials. When they struggle, they send people to help them organize and call this DevOps. Now, mature organizations tell teams to build a car, give them a credit card, and tell them where to find the raw materials. If teams struggle, DevOps team helps them organize, and cloud operations teams help them find the right materials and prep those for them. And now advanced organizations tell teams to build a car, the platform team prepares a platform, and the developers build on top, but remember, with all of the context that is very, very important. Yeah, I can share maybe a link to this. We can share maybe a link to this presentation so you can have a look at the white paper. I wrote a very extensive article on developer self-service. I actually wrote a new one last week on the 10 top fallacies in platform engineering to cover a lot of those. And now I would be happy to answer some questions if there are any. Sorry, I wasn't able to shoulder the cognitive load of reading through your questions if there were any.
So far, I think we just had folks calling out specific items in the presentation. I think there was a lot of really great content. So I haven't seen any questions, but feel free to come off mute or toss something in the chat.
I do have a couple of questions. One is, thank you for the great talk. That was great. Thank you.
My pleasure.
The first question is, I think it was on the slide. Let me sort of put a note. Yeah, I think that was on the slide 4. I initially thought that was like a bell shape, histogram type of things. But then towards the right end, towards on the right side, that going down and going up. That going up, I didn't quite follow what what that graph means.
Yeah, so we're mapping the total number of attendees in a certain bucket. It means that in this case that it's going up. It means that between 90 and 95 in scoring, there are fewer than in 95 to 100. So there is a slight increase in the total number of very advanced teams in the end.
Thank you.
The paper has a long appendix to discuss data in detail and how we derive this.
Mm. And the other question may be a little bit beyond what you described, but also quite related from, how to run the team, different level, develop operational and so on. Is when I hear that actually brought remind me from the educational system wise, we all know German car, great, BMW, business. One thing, remind me one thing is I think it's quite unique for the educational system in Germany. One is that Tech Hochschule. Many other countries did not have that layer of educational system. I think that really brings the, from the technology that exactly of those technique. I don't know whether that's something to do. I think that might also relate from your, philosophy on how you, like I say, weakest chain, weakest link of the chain, how you're working with, and so I think it's build everyone in the team strong. I think that's what I get from related to educational system in Germany. I'm not quite sure whether I express my thought clearly.
I understand where you're coming from. To be completely transparent, and doesn't shed a good light on my on my nation, but I think we're disastrous at software development. And I think compared to anything that happens in Canada and in the States, we're amateurs, really. So maybe we have a interesting educational system, but it's definitely not transferred into our ability to write good software.
Thank you.
We got a question from Pat, or we got Pat with his hand up. So I'm going to throw to Pat because I love a raised hand.
Cool. Yeah, no, I was super intrigued by this. I guess I'm wondering what your thoughts, like having worked with so many developer platforms. I'm often curious. I don't know. I feel like in technology, because of the way things move and how they move so fast, we kind of find, I want to say find, but it's also like we rediscover old things that I think are known elsewhere, understood in less systematic ways. Like agile philosophies weren't invented by agile people, but like they're kind of, I don't know, maybe they're like kind of Buddhist. There's like, they come from lots of different places, but like basically like I feel tech is a place to kind of discover and share patterns that work in many other areas. So this kind of idea of this diving into these developer kind of internal tooling that's very vibrant and dynamic and really supportive. Do you feel like do you see other places where you think that this is useful? In particular, I'm kind of like looking at the way the open source intelligence people are kind of like dealing with intelligence or in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. They're kind of talking about their need for certain things and tooling, and they're kind of like in this new terrain, doing lots of really interesting new work at once that doesn't have a precedent. And yeah, I've been kind of trying to understand how tech tools might support, but not to make it too specific about that. I guess I'm just curious whether you have any thoughts on whether these internal dev self-serve things are applicable to other areas, whether you see those opportunities.
I'm really sorry. I just cut out there.
Oh no.
Let me try and I can try and paraphrase.
Sure.
So I think the question was whether you see the potential for developer platforms, or let's say self-service, in other spaces like access to data, open source community effort, and like in the broader, I guess, global ecosystem. And I guess that's a question coming from sort of an enthusiast standpoint rather than a professional standpoint.
Sorry, can you repeat the first sentence? I'm very sorry, but I'm in Berlin, and you know that we're basically third world if it comes to infrastructure. But can you repeat
Yeah,
the
so
first part of the sentence, please?
have you, maybe I can boil it down even further. Have you seen self-service platforms anywhere else that is outside of software development, maybe in places like data or open source, that look really interesting?
Whether I see concrete examples of software that covers this element.
Maybe it's I guess it's more whether are there any areas, the things that you're working with inside our companies, whether you get excited about those sort of tools being available to other professions, other fields, other like the sort of things we're building for ourselves. What will it be like when others have access to those sorts of like tools?
I'm sorry, let me really briefly reset this internet connection, and then I'll be back, okay? Sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry if my question is terrible. It's hard for me to tell the connection from just like my poor words.
I think I know where you're
Which is
coming
all.
from. I think I saw something similar in the early COVID days, where you had all these separate clinics that were trying to leverage, all of the same things, right? Like everybody had the same problems. It was like, how do I have people book appointments? How do I make sure that we don't have a bunch of people like crashing a clinic? How do we allocate resources? How do we provide access to data, but not too much or put people at risk? And I think there were a couple of interesting efforts. I know a friend of mine was involved with a company called Helpful Engineering, which I think was like a non-profit organization that was just basically spinning up tooling for folks. Like they open sourced a respirator design, and they sort of created this like pattern library of like, here's how you manage booking at scale. Like how do you manage queuing and things, which I think is like, I mean, this is getting way off track now, I think, but something like Operation Warp Speed, but for like, the process and the like, all the plumbing rather than just vaccines or like testing. I think that's in the future, we'll start seeing these challenges. It's like you need self-service for everything, right? Like you need self-service for everything that doesn't need to be like deeply technical or like super vertically deep. And sometimes you just need to provide access to people to do something valuable and focus on what's like really important instead of like reinventing the wheel or like standing things up from scratch. So that's what I get from like something like platform engineering. Is like, it's a step towards that future where people can kind of bring their unique capabilities and experience and contribute value without having to know everything or start from, the first brick in the foundation. Like I like the idea that, it's kind of a romantic vision of like people bringing their capabilities from where they are, providing value and hitting that flow state so that they're constantly challenged and learning and getting better, but they start contributing from like day zero, and they're always contributing value, ideally, right? Like that's like the flow state for value from my perspective. Kaspar, I don't know if you have any, I'll give you a second to chime in on that if you like.
I totally agree. I think like platform engineering is an unfortunate word because it sounds so technical, but I think it's actually something deeply philosophical, and something that has a, if done well, very beautiful way of bringing out the best in really the individual contributors. So I'm just from a philosophical point of view, a huge believer in that.
Jonathan, I saw your hand earlier, and I saw it go away.
If you can hear me okay. I was thinking, I remember attending a talk years ago from some people at Pixar about how they have a very large software group that builds out the tools that they're using to render and build movies, but the people actually doing the animation, it's just a tool chain that sits underneath all of their stuff, and they're sitting down in front of a tablet and their drawing boards, and the actual infrastructure is immaterial to them. The only time they notice it is if it gets in the way of them building their stories. And it seems to me maybe we have to look at a bit of stuff like that. And sort of closer to home, I've just started a new company, and they have sort of a first generation of this internal developer platform, and they're trying to improve it. And one of the things I'm noticing is there's a sort of a small core of senior experts in the current system. And one of the problems I think they're having is, how do you bring on a new generation of developers and testers and people like that and get them up to speed without slowing down the current core of people? And because I think right now we don't have that level of completely seamless self-serve where people can just come in and figure things out. You need to know a lot about how the entire GitHub structure is set up and how all the underlying pieces work, and how, how the Kubernetes pods have been configured and how many clusters are split across and everything. So.
Yeah, so if I can really briefly chime in on this, I've had a good amount of conversations with people. What is abstraction? That's a really interesting question right here, because as developers, we usually react very allergic to being abstracted away. Mm-hmm. But then, yet, if you look at you zoom into the details, like we're somewhat being abstracted all the time, right? So yeah. There's a difference between whether you're writing low-level language or already a higher level of abstraction. We're okay with a certain level of abstraction. An really interesting comment that I heard from somebody at ThoughtWorks, if I remember correctly, is that he said that we are testing too much and we're observing too little. I found that a very, very clever comment, because in the end, developers don't really have a lot of problem with abstractions as long as they can, they know exactly where to dive in themselves to actually go into the lower level and dissect the underlying interplay in detail to be able to go down the rabbit hole and get the full context. And so abstraction, yes, as long as you feel you have all of the context. So to give you an example, I do a CLI command, get Postgres type A, and then something actually executes something, and then you get DB name, DB user, and you check how it works, and you see, okay, like latency that doesn't add up. And so what do? Like, uncomfortable abstraction means I have no idea what's going on. I'm being abstracted away. I'm frustrated. Transparent abstraction means that's the command. It's actually mapped to this underlying infrastructure as code file. I can go in, actually go through this in detail. If everything goes well, I can spare that cognitive load. I don't actually have to look at this. But if things go sideways, happens a lot in the end on a daily basis, I can actually dive in and I can gain service. It's really about abstracting in a way that doesn't keep me away from understanding the full context.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Jonathan, you reminded me of back when I was doing computer animation, before I decided to like lean into tech, I wanted to basically work for Pixar. Yeah. And when I was talking to folks who ran studios and were doing the work, they were always struggling to hire people. But what they would rather hire someone who knew how to paint, then someone who knew how to, you know, run the rendering software and set up their laptop and use the tools. You know, they would hire someone who'd never used a computer before they would hire someone who wasn't artistic, right? Who wasn't creative. And I think that, you know, once we really think about like what is adding value, what is the thing that we're really trying to do, you start to realize that you can put highly technical folks on building the foundation that allow creative problem solving people who are product focused and customer focused to do their best work. And I think that solves a lot of problems. You know, it allows you to not burn people out who don't really want to be in the weeds all the time. It gives you things like express lanes and collector lanes, right? Like you can hire people who know barely anything about code, but they have value to contribute, right? And you can have highly technical, highly sophisticated pro coders and low coders and no coders and everything in between, and just be able to give those people a way to create and deliver value. And I think that is going to be a superpower, especially as talent just gets crunched and crunched and crunched and crunched, right? Like, I mean, you're not going to be able to steal talent away and in 99% of companies. But, you know, if you invest your talent, if you don't have your highly technical folks or the folks who can really build complex systems mired in reinventing the wheel, then all of a sudden, you know, you can build these on-ramps to the collector lanes, the express lanes, and have people just sort of sit in their comfort zone, and where they're maybe not their comfort zone, their flow zone, right? That productive zone, and get them there and keep them there, rather than frustrating them, you know, or that they're either too low level or too high level, or, you know, there's just some mismatch. And I think that's really interesting. And I think it will be, you know, the folks who are investing in that platform approach, that's one of the byproducts that they're going to see, is that they're not burning out staff, and they can actually, I think, being able to hire someone from anywhere where you see ability and say, like, we can get you into a place where you can contribute value, and you don't have to meet a laundry list. You know, we care about your ability to solve problems, think about the customer, and really focus. Like, ultimately, that's what it takes. And maybe a handful of technical skills, but it doesn't have to be a laundry list. It doesn't have to be that Chinese food restaurant menu, like every possible thing. Because really, what are you using on a regular basis, right? You're repeating a lot of the same patterns and doing a lot of the same stuff. Like, nobody should be like building a login form in 2022, or, you know, like trying to find like what's the perfect color of blue, you know, as a front end developer. So that's nobody says that I, you know, picked the wrong color, because there's a design system or some other abstraction that I can just use. Anyways, Pat.
Yeah.
Take us home.
I guess
6.
I was gonna make, not to put you on the spot, Kaspar, but if you did feel like joining this like GatherTown spatial chat plugin, like space after, it's I don't know, it seems, I'm biased, but I feel like even the tool is worth knowing just for your other spaces if you haven't kind of played with it a lot. But I did have I guess the question, I was just really like the transparent abstraction thing, and wanted to like also toss in that Stuart Brand of the whole Earth catalog fame / I don't know, he's some other neat movements. He kind of was inspired by building envelopes and invented this thing talking about like culture and society. And he talks about pace layers. He's like, we have the fast moving things which sit on top, and there's each like almost like they all kind of build on each other, but there's like kind of I don't know, I guess the metaphor, I like to choose a textile metaphor. It's like it's not a shell in between. It's like a veil that you can always like push aside and pass through and go into the next. Which feels like I think about it all the time with like, this like, that's with tech stuff. Like, it's like, oh, you've got like a fancy UI tool, but it's running a script that's in the repo that you can go in, and inside the script, there's like all the long form flags. Cause like you don't need to save a few bytes. This place is, when someone's in here, they want to know how it's working, and like, and just all the way down having it be like legible. I so strongly vibe with that. I just really appreciated this.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I totally agree.
All right, folks. Well, that is a wrap for today. Again, I posted a link to Gather, so jump in there and bring your own topics of discussion. It doesn't have to be related to this session. It could be anything that's on your mind, anything you wish we talked about, anything you want to see in upcoming meetups. Bring that, talk about that, and otherwise we'll see you on Slack and see you next month. Thanks again, Kaspar. This was awesome. Great to see you again. Great to hear what you're working on, and look forward to your next update.
Thank you so much. I would really love to join you. Unfortunately, I'm already 2 minutes overdue in my next call. I'll come next time. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for listening.